Today we are going to look at this book, The Face of the Ancient Orient, a panorama of Near Eastern civilizations in pre-classical times, by author Sabatino Moscati. We didn't really find much information about who he was online, but he was well known for his Punic studies, etc. in Rome, Italy. And we found some small information online and some small information within this book, which reads: Professor Sabatino Moscati was born in Rome and studied in the Pontifical Biblical Institute and in the University of Rome. Since 1954, he had been Professor of Semitic Philology in the University of Rome, Italy, and he was a director of the Center of Semitic Studies in that university. And there's some nice remarks about him in this particular book. Okay, this is The Face of the Ancient Orient, a panorama of Near Eastern civilizations in pre-classical times, by Sabatino Moscati, translated from the Italian original. The Face of the Ancient Orient was originally published in Italy by Edizioni Radio Italiana. The first translation was published in London by Rootlegs and Keegan Paul Limited and so forth. Anchor Books edition 1962. And his dedication to a certain person. Here's the contents page. Figures containing a map, front to piece. Plans of Sumerian temple, plan of temple at Jerusalem, reconstruction. List of plates. Continued. Forward. I'm going to read this briefly. This book had its genesis, or its origins, in 1955, and in years prior to that, perhaps, the extensive archaeological discoveries made in the Near East had acquired an importance that extended far beyond specialist circles in his country, as elsewhere, the author's country. Historians, men of letters, philosophers, and people of education generally had all come to realise the need for more direct and up-to-date acquaintance with this cultural sphere because of the contributions it could offer to their own culture. The organisers of the scientific programme of the Italian radio sought to meet this need by asking the author to give a course of lectures aiming at the presentation of a complete, although summary, account of the civilization of the ancient Orient. The planning of this course called for a great deal of thought. Needless to say, one could have confined it to a summary of the outstanding events of political and cultural history, but this would have taken more time than had been allotted to the series. Nor was there much point in such an approach, since a number of books on the subject already existed. Moreover, the author had never been greatly interested in exposition as such, whereas he was more strongly attracted to the tasks involved in assessing a cultural epoch as a whole, and for that reason he chose a more difficult and more risky approach, one not previously tried, namely of attempting a comparative study of the essential and characteristic features of the ancient Oriental civilizations. How was such a project to be carried out, or carried through? To begin with, it was necessary to define the spatial and temporal limits of the subject. Then its outstanding historical personages had to be identified, and the distinctive cultural genres and attitudes successfully reviewed. Thus, the author would then be dealing not with just with history, but with the historical outlines, not with religion, but with the religious structure, not with literature, but with the literary genres, not with art, but with the artistic types. Finally, it would be necessary for him to draw together the threads to gather up the results of the investigation in a synthesis, which alone could give them meaning and coherence. The next problem was that of the material, in other words, the objective content of the history and the culture. Systematic exposition was out of the question, for the reasons already given. On the other hand, one could not omit the material altogether, or take it for granted, for that would have involved continual reference to source and material, making the course extremely difficult to follow, and so frustrating its object. The author adopted the principle of treating the material as typifying ideas, expounding it extensively within the framework of his general assessment as its justification, but not aiming to present it fully. For example, the Egyptian historical romance could be dealt with by way of a description of the sign new hair tail without analysing all the other material available. Thus the picture would acquire organic form without being in the least exhaustive. And he carries on from there for the next few pages. Maybe he makes a dedication, different people to help him out. Part 1, the conditions. 1, the Oriental Renaissance. 1, the Orient in a new light. For some years, a profound transformation had been going on in their knowledge, or the author, etc.'s knowledge of the ancient Near East, or everybody's knowledge of the ancient Near East. A transformation for which the history of European culture suggested the apt name, the Oriental Renaissance. The transformation had been based fundamentally on archaeological data, but from archaeology it had naturally extended to literature, to religion, to art, and to the entire cultural sphere. It had its beginning in April 1928, when a Syrian peasant ploughing in his field ran his shear into the remains of an ancient tomb, and so discovered Ugarit. So what's that something? Did he discover the land of the remains of Ugarit or Canaan? True, the earlier years of the present century had seen other important discoveries, but that of Ugarit and those which followed have a significance reaching beyond their own local, or had a significance reaching beyond their own local limits, and had transformed a whole historical and cultural area. Those finds were equalled only by those which in the second half of the 19th century first revealed the previously almost unknown peoples of the ancient Orient. In the Oriental Renaissance, they may have distinguished 3 archaeological key discoveries: Ugarit, Mari, and the Dead Sea Scrolls. In all 3 cases, the discovery was made by chance. At Ugarit, a peasant was ploughing. At Mari, some natives were burying a dead man near the Dead Sea. A Bedouin was looking for a stray sheep. In all 3 cases, the additions to our knowledge at that time was revolutionary in their effect. Ugarit proved to be the site of an ancient city which had flourished for 4,000 years also, and had been the centre of the fertile cultural exchange between the Near East and the Mediterranean islands. Hundreds of texts, new in language and in script, revealed the beliefs and mythology of the peoples who preceded the Hebrews in Palestine and Syria. Mari disclosed another city of like antiquity, the centre of a state which in its heyday had held sway over a great part of northern Mesopotamia. Its diplomatic archives, containing over 20,000 documents, still in course of publication, they're still being translated and written about and then published, right? Were leading to a rewriting of the history of Western Asia in the first half of the second millennium BC, and they revolutionised their chronology by advancing their dates for ancient Western Asia by about 2 centuries. The Dead Sea Scrolls were older by several centuries than the earliest Hebrew manuscripts hitherto known. Their biblical texts were especially valuable to scholars in the field of textual criticism, while the non-biblical texts threw a new, vivid light upon the beliefs and the ritual of the Hebrew world on the eve of the Christian era. In addition to these, there had been many other significant discoveries. For example, in the field of prehistory, the American excavations in the Kukuk region furnished material covering the Mesopotamian, Paleolithic, and Mesolithic periods, and had yielded new information on the Neolithic and Chalcolithic periods. In the historical field, the documents found at Alakh, and a further collection from Ugarit enabled them to verify and fulfill out from local sources their knowledge of the policies pursued by the great empires in Syria after the middle of the second millennium. In the field of law, ancient codes had been discovered which lay bare the foundations of the works of the great King Hammurabi and indicate to the tradition to which he and the other Oriental legislators belonged. Finally, in the sphere of art, the excavations at Nimrud, together with those at Ugarit and Mari, brought light work so remarkable and significant as to call for a revision of the accepted opinions on much of Near Eastern art. Obviously, all this new information affected certain regions more directly than others, and the same applied to the various periods. However, paradoxically yet understandably, this fact rather increased than diminished the change in their knowledge, in all their knowledge. And so forth, he goes on. Taking the comparison further might suggest that the present phase in their knowledge of the time of the ancient Orient was still that of an incipient renaissance, a humanism in which scholarly activity was almost entirely absorbed in their discoveries, their publications and their analysis. To fit the individual results into the general picture and to reorganise their knowledge accordingly remain tasks for the future. When these tasks would be accomplished, it seemed impossible to foretell when that would be in that period, in his day. And they would see the consummation of the Oriental Renaissance. Its main significance would certainly lie in the reconstruction of the foundations of classical civilization, which hitherto had been only partially and imperfectly determined. Where Greece and Rome had been assigned their proper place in the historical process, when the premises and conditions of that process had been defined, they would see how extensive, varied, and at times decisive was the influence which the ancient Orient, which preceded them, exercised on those civilizations. And he took some more on that. The ancient Orient had come by a widely accepted scholarly convention to mean the ancient Near East, and it was justified by the indubitable general unity of the different components of that region. Its history began at a very remote period in time, with documents that mark the dawn of history itself in the Mediterranean basin, and then continues uninterruptedly within an area enveloped for much of the time in the obscurity of peoples lacking written documents, and therefore lacking history. The Eastern Mediterranean basin constitutes the common centre of attraction or gravity for its peoples, who all, sooner or later, turn towards that basin and find on its coast places of meeting and intercourse. For this reason, we could use another apt term, or applicable term probably, the Mediterranean East. This separates it from the cultures of India, and even more of China, which have different centres of gravity and developed in substantial independence. Nor is it simply a matter of separation. The Near East, with its trends towards the Mediterranean, played an important part in the task of laying the foundations of classical civilization, to which India and China made a much more limited contribution. Passing from west to east, the ancient Oriental world includes Egypt, Palestine, Syria, Arabia, Anatolia, Mesopotamia and Iran. Viewing this area as a whole, we may take as its nucleus the Arabian desert with its wastes of sand. Around it, the Fertile Crescent extends in a great arc consisting of the Mesopotamian and Egyptian river valleys with the Syro-Palestinian region which links them together. The crescent is the most fertile expanse in all the Near East. Beyond it to the north and the east curve the tablelands of Anatolia and Iran. Agriculturally, poorer but possessing notable natural resources from timber to stone and metals. However, this demarcation of the extent of the ancient Orient involved them in certain difficulties. In the first place, were they to include the Iranian civilization in the scope of the argument? Opinions on this point were divided, but they inclined to think that they should, precisely because of the criteria of interdependence and gravitation towards the Mediterranean, which this author just specified.